we are going to go ahead and get into the meat of our discussion, which is the rise and fall of Andrew Yang. Now, quick warning before we jump into this. This is sort of a comprehensive breakdown of Yang's, entire campaign, really, since it started in 2018 all the way up to today. And so we'll be covering a lot of ground, but we're also obviously going to be missing a lot of details. And so if you have any details that you want to go ahead and share or opinions, please, jump into the conversation. Tell me what you think. Tell me how you feel, because there's a lot to discuss. I will try to read the comments, and I'll try to, share some of your thoughts out during the stream. But we do have to go through a lot of talking points. So I want to go ahead and touch base because there's a lot of things that people feel about Andrew Yang and his campaign. And I wanted to be able to cover some of these things. And so if somebody says something in the chat like, hey, you didn't mention this, but I did mention it in like an earlier talking point and maybe they came a little bit later. If you're watching or if you're in the chat, please try to let them know or inform them that, hey, we talked about this, or, this is what he said. And I also know that Andrew Yang, surprisingly, today he released a podcast talking about how he lost, like why he lost, and apparently what he plans on doing next. I didn't get a chance to do that or to watch it because I was working on this. So I still need to go ahead and listen to that. So, I don't think it's going to be like throwing a wrench into this whole conversation. Everything that we're talking about right now is still going to stand unless he comes out and says, I'm an alien and I'm not actually Andrew Yang. He splits his head open and he's like, he's some weird demon creature. Unless that happens, then I think that we're pretty good. All right. So the rise and fall of Andrew Yang starts with a conversation about the rise of Andrew Yang. He kind of came out of nowhere, and so where exactly did he come from, and where did most people find out about him? For me, I actually found out about him through the Joe Rogan podcast. Now, I know a lot of people are gonna, wince at me mentioning this, that I listen to his podcast, but it's not so much that I listen to Joe Rogan because I think oh man, this dude is enlightening. Not at all. It has more to do with the fact that this is a person who has amassed a massive platform. He's interviewing presidential candidates. He's interviewing billionaires. He's interviewing celebrities and athletes. And this isn't to say that I'm trying to gas Joe Rogan up so much as I'm trying to say that if this is a focus within media and this is a disruptor within the space of media, as somebody who works in branding and marketing, it is my responsibility to know what is going on, to know why politicians are fighting to get onto Joe Rogan's podcast versus fighting to get onto, cable TV. And so there's a lot of things that go on in his podcast, and a lot of people who sort of expose themselves or reveal themselves. And so I remember I first saw Andrew Yang back in 2017 or 2018, early 2018, in an article from NextShark where they were talking about hey, this Asian man is, running for president. And I remember seeing it and I was like, what the I gotta admit, my initial reaction, and I hate that I felt this way, but my initial reaction was he's not for real. This is a meme. He's not really running, right? And I kind of felt bad that I just so casually dismissed him as a candidate before. Not to say that oh my God, Andrew Yang, yay. It has more to do with the fact that man, I feel it almost feels like this internalized racism of feeling I just, I instinctively just didn't trust him because he was Asian, because I just thought that, he wasn't taking it seriously. And so it wasn't until a couple of months later or about a year later when I saw that Andrew Yang was on the Joe Rogan podcast. So this is about 2018. And I remember listening to this podcast in the background. I was playing Smash Bros, or I was playing Subnautica or something like that, right? And I just remember hearing it in the background and not really thinking much. Like just thinking, okay, I'm just gonna have this thing, on autopilot, and I'm just gonna go ahead and play these games. And then I realized that I was listening to this whole thing for like 2 hours, like the whole 2 hour podcast, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is kind of interesting. Like this dude has something actually interesting to say, and sort of the hook of his brand was that he was talking about that he was an Asian man who likes math. And initially, like, as somebody who talks about race and stereotypes, I, again, sort of revealed this internalized racism within myself, because I was cringing at that idea. I was like, oh my, did the only Asian candidate, did he really go in and position himself as the math guy? Like, come on. And I was so frustrated. I was like, oh my God, like, you're just trying to like buy into this stereotype. You're just trying to like get white people to like you. But then I started to think about it, and I remember I was like, you know what? That's actually not a bad thing. Like, being an Asian person who likes math, that inherently isn't a bad thing. Like, and it made me think about how oftentimes a lot of Asian Americans, in trying to distance themselves from these stereotypes, will sometimes, in a lot of ways, downplay these parts of their culture. Like the way that Asian men have for such a long time have felt like they had to distance themselves from martial arts because they felt like they were running away from the Bruce Lee stereotype. They didn't want to be called Jackie Chan. They didn't want to be called Bruce Lee all the time. Even though these are amazing people, as an Asian man, you just didn't want to be like reduced to only that. And so that's the sort of sensation that I got when I heard the whole math thing. But then I realized that, again, there isn't a problem with being an Asian person who likes math. There isn't a problem with being an Asian person who's good at math. And so, he sort of talked about how he's a numbers guy, and that he likes math because he sort of sees it as a foundation for understanding how to solve and understand problems. And so he's sort of the dude who cares about data and facts, and he was talking a lot about different data and facts about what was going on with the United States. And I think, at that time, it was such a departure from Donald Trump, who is all hyperbolic, who is all talking about, these narratives like, oh, well, I talked to this housewife, and the housewife says, oh, we really need to do something about critical race theory. And I was just like, oh God, like, you always felt like Trump was like, where is Trump coming up with these billions of dollars figures and these wild statistics? Whereas you hear Andrew Yang talk about it, and it just seems very matter of fact, and it seems very much more grounded in reality. And then you started to learn a little bit more about him. Okay, so math dude. All right, what else? What else is there about math? Well, you learn that he was also a former lawyer who was, once he graduated from college and from law school, he was only a lawyer for 5 to 6 months. He said that he hated it. He said that the work was, soul crushing, and he transitioned from that to get into startup companies. He was working for a test prep company that was eventually acquired by Kaplan. Now, I am a very vocal opponent against test prep and the SATs, and I think all that is bullshit, and all of it's rooted in eugenics. And I was like, this is my red flag. I was like, uh-oh, what is this? Like, what, like, is he a shill for this? But then he was talking about how, like, actually, I learned from that experience that this isn't the best way to teach people, and this isn't a best way to test and gauge who gets to go into our universities or not, because universities are a propellant for social mobility, and if you are prohibiting people from coming in by having these very rigged standardized tests, then it just becomes this competition of who has the most resources to be able to test for this SAT. And so I'm glad that at least he had that sort of perspective looking back. And I guess he after that he moved on from test prep, and he started a company called Venture for America. So he left the test prep company. It was bought by Kaplan. he took the money that he made from that to start a company called Venture for America. And the concept, my understanding, for a Venture for America is that it is an organization that is designed to address American brain drain. So if you're unfamiliar with this concept of brain drain, it's this idea that when people graduate from all over the United States, from the Midwest, from the South, oftentimes because of the location of some of the top universities, they're oftentimes located in more well-to-do areas. And so what that ends up happening is you have people who are from their local communities, fleeing their local communities, going to these college towns and metropolitan areas. And then when they actually work, by going to these high-end or these, high-profile universities, a lot of them feel incentivized to work on Wall Street, to work for big tech companies. And what you end up happening is these brilliant minds who, started from a community that is struggling and they moved on to find a better opportunity. But instead of taking the fruits of their labor and their success and then taking that to, rebuild their communities, they went off to continue to build already existing and already thriving communities. And so my understanding of Venture for America was it was trying to sort of adjust that balance of, hey, instead of bringing all these people and taking them and shoving them into San Francisco, into New York, into LA, instead, let's go see if we can start a program where we can incentivize these new graduates into starting companies and building up companies in, areas that need help, providing different jobs and different opportunities. And I was like, okay, interesting. That's sort of an interesting concept of understanding the problem of these universities, the problem of this sort of elitist mentality and the brain drain that comes from people graduating from these elite institutions and feeling like they need to stay with other elite people. And there's even like a documentary on Netflix. I don't know if it's still around, but it's about Venture for America. And I didn't watch the whole thing, but so far I was like, okay, it seems pretty straightforward. Not all of these people that they were funding did very well because, it's startups. A lot of startups fuck up. A lot of people's ideas fuck up. And that's sort of a normal thing. So it seemed like it was a pretty noble pivot from test prep, right? Okay, cool. So then what happens next? Well, you find out that through the work at Venture for America, he was actually recognized by the Obama administration. He was recognized by Obama as a champion of change. He was, appointed the ambassador for global entrepreneurship. He was sort of in this position where he actually had a pretty big bird's eye view of what was happening in America. And you start to see okay, maybe this guy actually does have experience, I thought that he was just some rando who has no experience in politics, who has no experience in a higher level type of organization where he's actually helping people, on a national level. And so this sort of had some tinge of that, those types of qualifications, some political experience. And so it was kind of like, okay, well, I guess he's sort of this outsider who knows how the system works. Okay, interesting. So through his work with the Obama administration, through his work in Venture for America, he had been traveling around the United States a lot. He'd been visiting different factories, visiting different businesses, asking questions like, how are things going? What are you all struggling with? What do you need? And I think from that, one of the things that he had learned by looking at the data and looking at the math is that artificial intelligence and automation were the real problem. Because this is during Trump's presidency, and this is at a time when you had a lot of people who were blaming the massive job losses in the United States on immigrants. And they were saying that immigrants were stealing our jobs, immigrants are coming over here, and they're ruining our culture. And Yang said, I had looked at the numbers, and I had talked to a bunch of people around the country, and I was tracking the expansion of the automation of manufacturing. And by tracking how many different companies started to automate their processes, how many different companies started to introduce artificial intelligence within their software, within the whole entire company, to restructure and shave off hundreds of employees in exchange for one piece of software. Like, there was just so much massive change happening around the United States, and it was all sort of in line with the adoption of artificial intelligence and automation. And so what he was saying was that according to these numbers, based off of the relationship between, the adoption of AI and then the beginning of income inequality in that particular neighborhood, he was saying that the loss of jobs resulted in more people feeling, desperate and dire in their situation. And oftentimes when that happens, when you have people who can't even, care for their basic needs, they don't have anything, they're not being assisted by, our government, they don't have a safety net. These are people who end up becoming conservative. These are a lot of people who feel like, oh, well, the system didn't work for me. The system is failing me. The Democrats aren't doing anything. Like, they're supposed to be the ones who are supposed to help us. Oh, well, we need to, instead, I need to lift myself up by the bootstraps. And that's oftentimes why you have a lot of figures like Donald Trump who rise to power, because when people are sort of in that dire situation, you have a dude like Trump who sort of just positions himself as this great billionaire who extends this hand and he's like, hey, poor person, I'm going to help you. And so, you have this trend of a loss of jobs resulting in sort of a spread of more conservative ideologies, a scarcity mindset. And then that also contributes to income inequality, because you have these people who just don't even believe in progressive politics and don't want to be able to actually change any of these things. And so I appreciated the fact that by talking about this, Andrew Yang highlighting automation and artificial intelligence, that he was actually pointing blame at the right target, that the problem was our system. The problem was hyper-automated capitalism, replacing humans and reshaping human value. This was the issue. And it was sort of a light bulb moment, because I didn't see that before. I didn't get it. I didn't realize that this was like a huge thing. But, when you actually go in and do the research on the adoption of automation and artificial intelligence, it's legit. Like, the amount of jobs that artificial intelligence and automation can displace is so much more than when a company starts up a factory, and increases the production of their goods and services. Like, the problem with artificial intelligence and automation is that it's kind of under the surface. We don't see it. We don't see robots literally taking our jobs. We don't see, the Terminator coming in and shooting people at Walmart. And, it's not this dystopian, vision of what we think the robots are coming kind of thing is what it would look like. And so he identified the problem as AI and automation. And in terms of the solution, he talked about universal basic income. And he said that, okay, well, what is universal basic income? What the hell is it? And he basically he didn't explain this. I learned that there are multiple forms of basic income, and there are multiple ways that you can implement it. There are a lot of creative different ways that you can go about funding it and distributing it, and there have been different trials around the world about people trying out the idea of a basic income. But the simple understanding of a basic income is that a basic income is a no strings attached form of direct cash payment that covers all of your basic needs. So there's a couple of different things within that. One, it's no strings attached, meaning you don't have to pay it back. It's not taxed. You don't have to spend it on this or that. You aren't limited on where you can spend it on. And that does, leave a lot of discussion for people who are like, oh, well, people are going to spend it on drugs. But, a lot of proponents of UBI are like, well, who gives a shit? If people want to spend it on drugs, fine. If people want to spend it on, buying dog food. If you want to spend it on rent, fine. Let them spend the money how they want to spend it, because whenever you're dealing with financial problems, it's so much more complicated than just, oh, I have an EBT card and I can just solve my problems by taking this EBT card and buying the thing that I need to solve my problem. It's like, well, no. Sometimes you have a car payment that needs to be addressed. Sometimes you need to go ahead and pay for your kids, whatchamacallit? What is it when kids go to field trips? Woo, it's been a long time. It's been a long time since I've been to school. Field trip fees, like your kid wants something for Christmas. He wants an Xbox, whatever, right? There are a lot of different things in your life that need to be paid for that are actually like, you see it as a need. You see it as something that, should be paid for. You want to be able to pay for that. And things like UBI would be able to it would just treat people like humans and allow them to feel like, you're responsible enough. You can handle this on yourself. You can go ahead and buy the things that you need. And some of the benefits of universal basic income, one of the main benefits for me that I felt was, when you give people a basic income, you also give them the power to say no to other forms of employment. There are some people who take jobs because there's literally no other options. Maybe it's like the location that you're in. Maybe it's your own identity and the fact that there is heavy discrimination towards people of color, towards women, towards seniors, towards people who have disabilities. And these are people who are completely left out of the job market. And so universal basic income would allow them to not have to resort to under the table work or work that is, unsafe or work that is too far from home. And so a universal basic income would give them that space to say, you know what, I know you really need this particular job, but at least you have this basic income to continue to pay, your rent, continue to pay for food, and just, cover some of these basic expenses. So that way you don't have to take that crappy job 30 miles out. So it does have that freedom, which I really liked. And the history of universal basic income is pretty varied. There's been a lot of people who have supported it. Everyone from, people have mentioned Thomas Paine, Milton Friedman, who's a conservative economist, but also Martin Luther King. And there are also a lot of progressives around the world who actually support universal basic income. Because again, UBI isn't Andrew Yang's idea. A lot of people get that mistake. They think that UBI is Andrew Yang, and although that is sort of relevant in a modern sense, that he sort of helped popularize this idea, he did not by any means invent this idea. Martin Luther King called it a guaranteed minimum income. And yeah, there are so many people who are politicians in the United States who are pushing for a universal basic income. So it's not just Yang. And on top of all these different trials, even Alaska has a form of a UBI. They have what's known as the Alaskan Fund, and it's paid out every single year. And in terms of how he wanted to pay for it, he was talking about, the idea of a value-added tax. And that sort of went in tandem with artificial intelligence, because the way that a value-added tax works is every time value is added during the process of development of a product or a service. So if you have, say, for example, a piece of metal, when you take that piece of metal and you send it to the factory to hammer it down to make a shape, that adds value. And when that happens, there is a tax. And then when that raw object has to be painted and designed, and it gets sent to this other place where they do that, well, then that is an additional tax. And even in the case of automation, when automation is at work, every single time an Amazon robot, makes a delivery, that could be taxed. And so there was definitely a way to actually integrate a pretty interesting tax system that would benefit from the gains of artificial intelligence and automation, because that's one of the biggest problems with artificial intelligence and automation in terms of displacing workers. When you displace 50 workers with one robot, all of the money that would have been paid to those 50 workers, their pensions, their salaries, their health care, money for their kids, all of that gets packaged up, and the robot doesn't make the money. Who makes money? The company does. The business owner does. And so, this was a really innovative way to go around the way so many wealthy people avoid a wealth tax. Once you learn about wealth taxes and once you learn about how easy it is for a lot of these people to avoid a wealth tax, because a wealth tax is like, people will just, hide their wealth in offshore accounts. They'll hide their wealth in real estate. They'll hide their wealth in, fine art, cryptocurrency, whatever. They'll establish their wealth as, oh, well, I actually don't have any wealth because I have all this debt. But then that debt is a way to mask how much wealth you have. Whereas a value-added tax was an opportunity to say, all right, you want to have this money-making scheme? You can try to do that. But by having a value-added tax, this is a toll tax. This is a tax where if you want to even participate in the market, you have to pay every single time. And so that's what I really liked about this idea. It just seemed like it was sort of like, all-encompassing. It had a way of extracting the money. It had a way of sort of distributing it back to the community. So from that, he moved on and he, started his campaign for the 2020 presidential race. So let's go ahead and get into that. So the first thing I want to discuss is Andrew Yang's underground media campaign strategy. Because if we want to know how he rose to power, we have to understand how he did that. So presidential media campaigns, surprise, surprise, are very, very astronomically expensive. Like, you need tens, hundreds of millions of dollars in some cases to run an effective campaign. And because of the nature of how expensive it was, Andrew Yang sort of promoted himself on alternative media sources, independent media sources. So he was on like all these different podcasts and YouTube channels, and he sort of explained it as, I'm going to go on to whatever platform anybody wants. If anybody wants to take me up for an interview, I'll be glad to bend their ear and talk about my message. And so you saw like Andrew Yang in really unusual places that other political candidates just would not even touch. He was on like the Fung Brothers. He was on the H3 podcast. He was on people's live streams. And so I think this really showed a sophistication in terms of Andrew Yang in the campaign understanding the landscape and the power of social media and independent media. Like, there are so many of us. I mean, the people who are even watching me right now, there are so many folks who, several years prior, you might have been watching MSNBC at this time, but now you're watching me. And that's a very different shift. And there are a lot of other media outlets and other podcasts and other YouTube channels who are pulling in huge numbers. And so he sort of recognized that, hey, like, they represent an audience that deserve to be talked to as well. Because that's the thing, like, when your community has a presidential candidate, it's sort of like, whoa, oh shit, like, it sort of validates you in a sense. And so Yang going on these different platforms almost became this like form of validation for a lot of these independent media platforms where we're like, oh my gosh, I got a presidential candidate. And so that is really how he grew through his underground campaign strategy. Now, the other part of that was this idea of fighting in the enemy's den. So one of the biggest criticisms of Andrew Yang, which I still stand firm that I actually think it was a good strategy in the large sense. So one of the things that he was known for doing was he was willing to go on different media sources and talk to different niche media outlets, and also that meant more conservative media outlets. And so this dude was on the Ben Shapiro show. He was talking to Dave Rubin. He was on Fox News. I think that he was on a couple other ones as well. And I remember when I first heard about that, I was like, oh God, he fucked himself. He killed it. No. But I watched it and I was like, okay, I see what's going on. Like, it wasn't so much of a, hey guys, like, I'm white like you, but more of a matter of like, hey, this is my message. And, I understand that there's all those polarization, but we need to understand where this polarization is coming from. It's coming from automation. It's coming from AI. And you started to see in the comment section, like, again, I was like, I had spent so much time making sure that I was like, I knew what I was looking at, that Yang wasn't just going to this platform to, kowtow to, the worst far right people, but that he was actually having an impact. And you could see that in the comment section where people were like, hey, I'm a lifelong conservative. I didn't realize, this thing about automation. I didn't realize this thing about income inequality. And he was actually changing people's minds, like literally changing a lot of people's minds who were deeply conservative, And for me, it was like, that was what made me realize that, okay, there was an advantage to him being there. Because I think for a lot of people of color, for a lot of activists, for a lot of progressives, we feel like, okay, we don't want to be giving these platforms any visibility. We don't want to support them. And I 100% get that. And I 100% understand if people don't want to sort of platform their ideas. But if you are going to go and talk to these people, then at least have the guts to back up your ideas, at least have the guts to push back on their ideas that are toxic, and try, if you can, to bend some ears, And luckily, I felt like that is what he was trying to do. But unfortunately, a lot of people sort of saw this as like, oh, he's a conservative, he's a Republican, he's signaling to white supremacists. And one of the things that really became this basically a fucking meme, people were like, oh, Andrew Yang is a white supremacist because he talked about white birth rates. Or he was talking about like white death rates. And people have mentioned that, that is a white supremacist talking point, that white supremacists tried to say that, oh, white people are dying, therefore we need to limit immigration. But that wasn't what he was necessarily saying. He was more saying it from the perspective of the opioid epidemic has been a huge problem that has actually been taking the lives of a lot of white people. And so I can understand how people sort of got that perception from him, from saying that, but at least looking at the whole context, I didn't see that as him signaling to white supremacists. Because if you actually were on, because I remember one of the things I had done just to verify, just to make sure that I was like, okay, is he actually gaining the approval of just like these blatant white supremacists? And I remember looking and I saw like even Richard Spencer had talked about him and he was like, oh, I actually like that guy. And I was like, oh my God, no, this is the worst fucking person. Richard Spencer, the fucking Nazi. Why? This is horrible. But even his reason for supporting Andrew Yang was like, he supported Andrew Yang because Richard Spencer said that he learned about universal basic income a long time ago and he thought that it was a good idea and that he thought Yang would be a person who might want to push for that. But he never mentioned anything about like the whole white supremacist, saving white lives kind of a thing. And even when I was going on like fucking conservative forums, I was going on 4chan and I was trying to figure out like, what do these people feel about Yang? And then I saw like an endless supply of like really deeply fucking racist ching chong jokes about Andrew Yang. And then I was just like, okay, yeah, he is not winning the white supremacist vote. He is, I think, he was sort of working towards de-radicalizing a lot of people who were more right-wing. So that was sort of how I understood this whole Andrew Yang is a Republican kind of thing, at least in this era of his career. Now, through all of this, I think we should also sort of ask, why did he go viral in the first place? Like, how did he catch fire? What was it about Andrew Yang and his campaign that made him such a success? And I think the primary thing that I sort of identified was that Andrew Yang was two things. One, he was a candidate. I feel he was the candidate of the internet. He came into our view through the internet. He didn't have a traditional career in politics. And so, by having that sort of origin on the internet just tends to love underdogs. And a lot of internet communities are all about taking something that is, underground and boosting it up until it becomes gargantuan. So whether you're talking about, cryptocurrency, or whether you're talking about, that infamous Instagram egg page where it was just literally a picture of an egg, and then there was this campaign to get that one Instagram page to more followers than Justin Bieber. And or what was it? Kylie Jenner. Like that was like the bar that they were trying to raise. And so I'm just talking about how important it is for us to understand how internet culture works, and the fact that internet culture thrives on this idea of like, yeah, we know that we're sort of seen as these social outcasts who just hide behind our screens, but we have the power to take something that is obscure and make it, mainstream. And that was sort of one of the appeals of Andrew Yang's brand, and a lot of good and potentially bad reasons. So because of that, Yang really was almost a candidate that a lot of people felt that they could mold. But the question started to be, okay, well, now that we see who is part of this, Andrew Yang's base, who is going to mold Andrew Yang? Like, is he going to be molded into the image of Ben Shapiro, or is he going to be molded into the image of more progressives? And so, as somebody who is an outsider looking to change the system, looking to, join the presidential race to contribute some of his ideas, he sort of appealed to a lot of people who felt that, they're tired of, corrupt politicians. They, even the people who sort of subscribe to the whole Donald Trump's drain the swamp mentality. And I think a lot of us in general, on all sides of the aisle, I think a lot of us are already just sick and tired of Democrats and progressives, or Democrats and Republicans. And a lot of us want better options. And some people are looking to third parties, and some people are looking to sort of expand the vision of what each party should be. Some of them are looking to push one party further to the left or further to the right. For me, I didn't necessarily care so much about like, ooh, I want Dems to win. I was actually focused on just UBI. Like, I was just like gung-ho about this idea of universal basic income. I just felt like, 2018, 2016, this whole Trump presidency is like we were looking at the through the barrel of a shotgun, and we're sort of deciding as a nation, what are we going to do? How are we going to solve this problem? How are we going to dig ourselves out of this ditch? And I felt like universal basic income was just the most elegant and simple way for us to go ahead and actually address this. There isn't this need to build all this infrastructure. We just need to go ahead and send out checks, help people now. And so, that became part of the crossover appeal. The crossover appeal of Andrew Yang was just, he was the guy who wants to solve problems. Okay, cool. That was sort of his brand. His brand was, I am Trump's antidote. Trump is this business insider who is super wealthy and white and racist, and Andrew Yang was positioning himself as a business outsider who was smarter than Trump, who understood math, and who wanted to help people. And so I saw the matchup. I saw the matchup between Trump and Andrew Yang, and I was like, I could see that. I could totally see that. I could see how, one great way to dilute the sting and pop from a, oligarch billionaire is to, instead of having a businessman versus, a politician, which oftentimes the discussion becomes, oh, well, the businessman is more ethical because the politician is naturally corrupt. I felt like, okay, well, at least Andrew Yang's brand can sort of cut through that by saying, okay, well, I'm neither a corrupt politician or a super uber wealthy, oligarch. I am a business person who, I'm the son of immigrants and blah, 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 blah. And so there was this appeal of like, okay, I could see how he could beat Trump. Let me read just a couple comments real quick. Hannah 1 says, over 50 mayors across the country have joined the Mayors for a Guaranteed Income Coalition. Ask your mayor to join. Yeah. I've been I've been following some of these Marriage for Basic Income, and I actually saw some of them on his podcast. Angel says, it is very possible to have certain issues that affect non-people of color communities be brought into discussion while at the same time them being part of white supremacist talking points. In many cases, most conservatives follow politicians that take advantage of their ignorance and fears and blame the other. This, of course, doesn't mean that white folks are free of fault for being taken as suckered, but it is something to consider. Yang did try hard to focus on policies and issues as opposed to the radical political aspects, even though those things exist as well. And Hannah says, he literally had a policy on de-radicalizing white supremacists. He kind of buried it later on, though. Yeah, and that's the thing is that, like, even early in his campaign, I remember him talking about, like, experiencing racism and white supremacy. But as his campaign started to grow, he wasn't really vocal about that part. And I was kind of frustrated. I was like, okay, like, come on, man, like, talk about it. All right. Next point here. Embracing the cringe. Oh, gosh. Okay, so, part of following Andrew Yang was embracing the cringe. It was about accepting the fact that this is just a dude with a lot of corny dad jokes. Always laughing, sometimes, in times when he probably shouldn't, and maybe it could have been a nervous thing, maybe it's just sort of a habit of his. I'm not necessarily going to judge him for laughing necessarily, but it was part of, like, his brand, and I think that he was, unfortunately, kind of boomerish when it comes to certain social issues. I think that he was definitely well-meaning, but I didn't think that he had the sophistication that a lot more millennials and X-Gens and Zoomers are when it comes to social issues. And but I do say that I appreciate the fact that he was willing to admit that the times that he was wrong, and he, especially early on, like, he wasn't trying to be fake. Like, you could tell that, like, okay, obviously some of these jokes aren't landing, but he just kept saying them because that you can just tell that was just him. Like, that is just this dude. He just says a lot of, like, corny dad jokes and stuff like that, and that's just his thing. Fine, whatever. And I think over time people learned to sort of appreciate that he wasn't, trying to be somebody who he wasn't. And so that sort of leads into this question of who are the Yang Gang? Like, who are these people that were even voting for him? Because there were a lot of people who were saying, oh, Andrew Yang's Yang Gang, they're all this, they're all that. And it really just depends on who was talking. Because I can say that the Yang Gang was a real mixed bag. Like, you had on two opposite ends, people who are more far left and people who are further right, and then a lot of people who were in the middle. And primarily, I think, again, the main connective tissue was that these were all people who supported universal basic income. And these were all people who essentially just lost hope for our entire system, and they were looking for a new solution. They were looking for something different. And so because of that nature of this mixed community of people from all these different ideologies and backgrounds, there was, in my experience, dealing with the Yang Gang, there was a constant tug of war between these dueling sides. There was a constant war between the conservatives of the Yang Gang movement, the centrists of Yang Gang, the progressives of Yang Gang, the far, far left of Yang Gang. And so, I'd say that one of the benefits of that is that naturally the progressives are way fucking smarter, and they were actually doing some pretty fucking good work in terms of, like, de-radicalizing a lot of these conservative Yang Gangers who, a lot of these people were also very young, who were like, oh, I'm into this edgy conservative thing of Donald Trump. And then, Yang's brand came in that was fun, and it allowed younger people to sort of participate and not feel inundated by politics. Because that's another thing that people need to understand is politics can be very, it can turn off a lot of people, and how deep into the weeds of political speak a candidate engages in can have a really big effect on how accessible that candidate is. Because if a candidate is, like, constantly talking about, oh, Bill C-32 section blah blah blah, like, sometimes it's just like, I don't even know what the fuck this person's talking about. But if you're talking about social issues in a way that like people can understand, like you're talking about it in human terms, you can relate to a lot more folks. And so he was starting to change a lot of people's minds on universal basic income, which again, people still feel like, oh, free money. Oh, it's just free money. You're just going to make everyone lazy. But no, like he did a lot of work in changing people's mind and pushing that needle for universal basic income and a lot of the social issues that came packaged with solving universal basic income. So rights, for working mothers and people who have disabilities. And so there was definitely a strong presence of Andrew Yang's ideologies in these conservative spaces from the perspective of people trying to de-radicalize a lot of red-pilled conservatives. And so, I think in general, the people who believed in Andrew Yang were the people who wanted to have a more optimistic view of the United States and wanted to have a view that, maybe we can go about this in a different way. And so the fight within Yang Gang really was the fight to see who Andrew Yang was ultimately going to represent in terms of his core. Like at the core of Andrew Yang's brand, his campaign, who was he really speaking to? And so that was just a constant ideological war. And I remember on Twitter, oh my God, like, because Andrew Yang was really good at like responding to comments and shouting people out and stuff like that. And you just saw people all over Twitter. Andrew Yang, it's my birthday. Can you shout me out? Oh man, it's my birthday. The thing I want more than anything is to Andrew Yang to retweet me. Like just nonstop. People constantly wanting to be in his circle. People building up platforms as like, oh, I am the Yang Gang, leader, or and then people who are starting different chapters of the Yang Gang, like. In Texas and California and New York, like this thing started to really, really spread. And again, a lot of it was also like people fighting for a chance to figure out who was going to be the center of the Yang Gang universe. Neil says, I think that was Yang's weak point. He didn't have a full grasp of social issues, which part of me gets not commenting on issues you don't full knowledge of. But at the same time, that can give off the image of caring. Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about talking on issues that you don't know what you're talking about, because Yang definitely fucking goofed on that shit in New York, but we'll save that for later. All right. Now let's go ahead and talk about a very important point, which is understanding #LetYang_Speak. So again, in understanding the rise of Andrew Yang, we also have to understand why it's important to understand. Oh, sorry, I'm like repeating myself. We need to understand the importance of let Yang speak, because the way that Andrew Yang was treated in the media was pretty fucked up. Like, regardless of how you feel about his particular policies, like when you're on a debate stage and you've earned the opportunity to be on a debate stage, because again, like not everyone makes it to that stage. Not everyone, once they get onto that stage, is going to have the same opportunity to really tell their story. And you really saw that during the debates where candidates were being asked questions left, right, and Andrew Yang was continually being ignored, and he didn't really have this chance to sort of answer questions. Agent says, I'm all ears, God. Oh, cool. Welcome back. But yeah, so a lot of people were upset that they were like, okay, Andrew Yang, like, they're actually skipping him on entire questions, or they're actually cutting him off, or they're letting other candidates talk for like 5 minutes, and then they're letting Andrew Yang talk for 30 seconds. So people were pissed off. They were pissed off that, mainstream media outlets were blatantly silencing and warping his talking points in the media, making it seem as if like, oh, he has nothing to say. He isn't standing up. But it's like, how can you stand up against the debate moderator in a field where there's like multiple other people there? Like, and so it just started to get really frustrating. And especially as an Asian American, I was like furious because I could feel I just remembered what that feels like to be in a professional environment, and because you're an Asian person, it's like being totally ignored because it's like, oh well, you're just like, you're the outside opinion, you're not like a real American, your opinion's out there. We need to have a more mainstream vision of what to do. And so I was getting frustrated for Andrew Yang. And I was getting frustrated with the fact that so many media outlets were like blatantly saying shit like, oh, universal basic income is for lazy people, and this is a pipe dream that it's never going to happen. This is America. We're never going to just hand out money. Do you think that we just hand out money for free? And I was just like, yeah, we have been. We've been paying the fucking military. We pay cops. There's so many things that we fund for free. But it's like, it's a matter of whether or not you think that paying for people to exist, to live, to have the basic needs is free, or if it's an investment in your people. So again, you can clearly tell I'm frustrated because I'm still passionate about UBI. I still fucking ride for this issue because I think it's so important. And so, that's why I think it's also just this conversation about Andrew Yang. For me, it's about universal basic income. Spoiler alert. But all right, anyways. And again, it was just frustrating because not only were they dismissing universal basic income, but they were also dismissing artificial intelligence and automation. And I was like, are you fucking kidding me, dude? We're talking about Amazon. Like, Amazon is the conversation of, the future of work and the abuse in the workplace that we've been having for the last several years. Amazon's warehouse is notoriously automated to the point that it's like downright inhumane how they treat their workers. Like, you have people who are literally monitored by a computer so that if they take a break for less than 5 minutes, they are within the rule set of Amazon. If you aren't shipping things and moving shit around, and if you are inactive for more than 5 minutes while you're on the floor, then you are subject to getting fired immediately on the spot. And that is enforced through artificial intelligence. That is enforced through this system that is monitoring people, like a hawk. And so when people started to say that AI and automation were alarmist and tech bro, I was like, oh my God, these people are so far behind in this conversation. If they don't even want to accept the issue of automation and artificial intelligence, then how are they going to be able to understand the need for something like universal basic income? And I was like, hey, write all the pieces that you want to say fuck Andrew Yang, but if you're trying to talk about these basic things that are impacting millions of Americans, why would you throw all that away because you don't like this one candidate? It just doesn't make sense. It's the same way that like people who don't like Bernie Sanders want to shit on Medicare for all, and it's just like, no. So that was my issue, is that this whole Let Yang Speak thing was more than just Andrew Yang being able to talk about his ideas on a debate stage. It was about the deliberate silencing of an entire spectrum of problems and solutions that no other candidate was talking about. No other candidate was talking about universal basic income. No other candidate was talking about widespread automation and artificial intelligence. And that was the issue. People saw that it was more than just disrespect for Yang. It was a disrespect to these problems and these solutions. Okay. Now, we'll get into another part of his 2020 race. So, Andrew Yang's problem with Asian American identity. Now, the first time I noticed this, the first time I really noticed that he was very lackluster in terms of his understanding and sophistication of race and identity, was the first time that he reacted to there was an SNL host or SNL cast member named Shane Gillis, this white dude, and he was making, like, he made this racist comment about Andrew Yang, and I can't remember what it was, to be honest. I'm just like, fucking racist people, like, they're a dime a dozen. I basically allude, like, making anti-Asian, like, accent, like mocking an Asian accent, and shitting on Chinese people, like saying shit like that, right? Like being a fucking racist piece of shit. And it was sort of tricky because when you're on the presidential stage and you're having this national conversation about cancel culture, and then you have this opportunity to at that point, Andrew Yang could have literally just pressed the red button and ejected this man from his career, like, forever. But at the same time, you're thinking to yourself, okay, well, like, how are people going to react? People are going to be like, oh, man, he ruined that comedian's life. And which, believe me, I would have had no problem with that. But people were just mad that he wasn't more assertive about that. But the thing that I had a problem with was that Andrew Yang basically likened it to, well, he's a comedian, and this is just what comedians do. And I was just like, bro, you could be a comedian and not be a racist comedian. Like, that can exist, like, you don't have to let these people fucking step on you just so you can, like, continue this image of yourself during the presidential campaign. Because it was more than just Shane Gillis, like, disrespecting Andrew Yang by saying this racist shit. He's disrespecting Asian people. And so, then there was this issue of when people are talking about, what Asian Americans can do to, show solidarity. One of the things that Andrew Yang had said was that Asian Americans need to lean into their patriotism, wear red, white, and blue. And I was just like, what the fuck, bro? What the fuck? I mean, look, I've grown to love the South. I will definitely say that. I have grown to love a lot of things about the South that I didn't think that I was going to like. But there are a lot of things I'm not going to do. I am not going to be wearing a fucking, Confederate flag. I'm not going to be shilling for Texas. And I sure as hell I'm not going to be donning an American flag to prove that I am American. Like, fuck you. No, I am American. And I think, again, that shows just the deeper levels of, like, if you aren't even providing the right solution for what you think Asian people should do for solidarity, like, what does that say about your understanding of the problem? And so he really is just, an example of, I think he's like a late X-gener or whatever. Because I know Andrew Yang's not a boomer, like a full-on boomer yet. But he really just showed his X-gen ass as being a privileged East Asian man who doesn't fully get it. And, I'm saying this as honest as possible. Like, he just doesn't. Even though he is the son of immigrant parents, the dude grew up and he had a relatively privileged life. He was able to go to a really good school. He graduated and he went into law. He became a CEO of a company. He sold that company, became another CEO of another company. He ran for president. It's like, he isn't struggling in his identity in that sense. Not to say that he hasn't, because he has dealt with racism and he continues to deal with racism as an Asian American. But it's just different, And I think because Andrew Yang was able to achieve his American dream, he, mistakenly just believes that other Asian Americans can just as easily attain their American dream. And that just isn't the case. There are a lot of differences and inequalities that prevent some communities from having that. And so I just believed that Andrew Yang, he wasn't a strong enough leader when it came to talking about Asian American issues and talking about racism. You can fight for Asian people and you can fight for people of color and still be for everybody. Like, he didn't have to go on this tirade of, like, fuck white people, ACAB. Like, he didn't have to go, like, full on, like, having the same energy that we have here. But he didn't have to, play such a fence-sitting position. He could have been more firm on his stance on the treatment of Asian Americans. And I think he did it with Stop AIP I Hate, but I think it was a little too late, at least in my opinion. All right. Next one, UBI versus the social safety net. So one of the most contentious things about this whole entire conversation of Andrew Yang was universal basic income, and a lot of conversations going on about, Andrew Yang's universal basic income, it's supposed to, it's going to completely remove the social safety net. And a lot of people felt like, if you accept the $1,000 that Andrew Yang is giving you, then you have to forfeit everything else. And this was a really complicated minefield. One, because Andrew Yang kind of changed his opinions about some of these things. And two, there were a lot of people who didn't like the fact that Andrew Yang wanted some people to, if you were accepting money from another program, that you would have to forfeit that in order to get the universal basic income. But the tricky thing was, it was a situational thing. Like, some programs, he said, would be able to stack on top of the $1,000. So you would have $1,000 on top of your disability, on top of, other programs. But when it came to direct cash payments like EBT, he said that you wouldn't be able to have. But even in that case, when I was doing looking into the numbers, I started to see, okay, I can see why that works, because when you actually look at EBT, when you actually look at what it takes to qualify for a lot of these different programs, there are so many hoops you have to jump through. And even when you jump through the hoops, there are so many people who, at the end of the day, they fit all these qualifications. They are at a certain income level that qualifies them to accept this payment, and yet their payments are like $100, $200 a month for groceries. And so I'm thinking to myself, yeah, a lot of people are talking about the disadvantage of forfeiting your EBT, but to go from a program that is capping people off at $200 and then switching off to, a universal basic income, it was a no-brainer for me. And Anne says EBTs can't buy diapers, toothpaste, and other essentials like toilet paper. Yeah, and that was another really big thing, is that EBT cards were very limited, and it didn't allow you to buy things in different places. You couldn't just buy tires if your car, ran over a pothole. You couldn't just use that money on the EBT card to pay for your child's field trip fees. And so this gave a lot more flexibility, and also it removed the stigma of EBT cards, because EBT cards, people have talked about this, that one of the biggest issues is that when they use EBT cards in public, people demonize them. People will say shit like, oh, well, I'm paying for your groceries and you're just a moocher. It's like, it's fucked up. Nobody should have to feel that way. Nobody should have to feel that way, And so universal basic income was sort of an alternative to that. And, this, like I said, this was a really contentious area of Yang's platform, because a lot of people, similar to the fight to form the Yang Gang in their particular image, a lot of people were trying to form universal basic income to help their communities. And it just showed that, for me, unfortunately, the thing that I saw from this whole entire thing was that all of these people needed help. All of these people needed help. And I wanted it to be that universal basic income stacked on top of everything. And hopefully what we would have is a universal basic income as a set floor for everyone. And then as everyone is able to sort of gain sort of control over their lives and get everything in order because their basic needs are met, then you can start working on developing and improving some of the other social programs. All right, now we've talked about the 2020 presidential race. Let's go into losing the 2020 race. So Andrew Yang, he had dropped out, and he endorsed Joe Biden. I got to say, I was disappointed. I was very disappointed because one, Andrew Yang had, I thought he had pretty good momentum, but I mean, I think from a campaign finance perspective, like, do you want to end early and sort of make people feel upset because you ended early, or do you want to keep going knowing that you're not going to win and then burning a hole through your finances and not being able to pay people? Because that's one of the problems that a lot of times these candidates will have, which is they will run for too long and they will eat through their budget, because again, it costs millions of dollars to run a nationwide campaign to be president. And so it's like, end early and take all of your losses and take all the money that you didn't have to spend on continuing to push the campaign? And do you take that and just like, give people a check and say, hey, thank you for helping me out. Let's go ahead and try again next time? Or do you just keep going and just like see what happens? So I appreciate it from that perspective. But again, Andrew Yang had talked about how he voted for Bernie Sanders in 2016. So I was like, well, why not endorse him then? If if he had talked about so vividly about his support for Bernie Sanders, then why not throw your support behind him? And I'd say that he definitely surprised a lot of other Yang gangers as well. Granted, Biden was sort of the candidate that at the time, because he was starting to really gain up in the polls, he made sense to a lot of people. He is the nominee, he is the president, so obviously, he won. And so that in that respect, people understand why Andrew Yang chose the proposed winner. But a lot of people sort of blamed Andrew Yang for Bernie Sanders' downfall. A lot of people were like, because Andrew Yang, through his support for Biden, everybody else followed, and Yang is the one who pushed the domino that led to Bernie dropping out. And that I disagree with, like 100%. Like, I think that's bullshit. Like, the dude knew that his time was up. He ended it. He threw his support by Biden because he knew that he was going to win. Do I wish he would have supported Bernie Sanders instead? Yes. Do I blame Andrew Yang for being the reason why Bernie Sanders didn't win? Absolutely not, because it's so much more complicated than that. Liz says one of the reasons why I stopped watching Judge Judy, quite judgmental on those that were in low incomes that had disabilities. Yeah, and that's one of the problems of a lot of our social safety nets, which is it demonizes a lot of people, and they're set up in a way where it makes people feel demonized for going to these offices and having to hand people their blatantly clear EBT card, and it sort of becomes this target on their back. Hannah says he also talked about supporting the nominee, a total cop-out, but a way to start sucking up to the DNC. Yeah, exactly. And that was the thing is, like, you just felt like it was him kind of giving up. And I get it from the perspective of, like, man, the dude ran a really good campaign. He had a lot of momentum. He was going pretty fucking, balls to the wall in this thing. But then he kind of just, like, conceded and then just, like, threw his support to Biden. And it just felt like you wanted him to have one last hurrah. But, it just wasn't... It wasn't the move that a lot of people were happy about. And a lot of people who supported Andrew Yang because they didn't like corrupt politicians stopped supporting him because he supported Biden. But yeah, I mean, Yang moved on. And unfortunately, Biden, like, a lot of people were expecting Andrew Yang to fight for a cabinet position on Biden's team, because Biden had talked about, like, Andrew Yang's a bright guy, we'll definitely want to be involved with him. And people were expecting him to be like, he's going to be, the Secretary of Labor or whatever. Like, he was going to have some sort of position in Biden's cabinet. But Biden didn't choose him. He chose a bunch of other people, which we'll have to do another conversation about that sometime, I guess. But yeah, Andrew wasn't picked. And then Yang moved on. And in terms of him moving on, right after, or at least, during this whole entire thing, that is when we had COVID. And when COVID happened, a lot of things had changed. A lot of people's perspectives on Andrew Yang actually changed, because he started to have a lot of relevance around the time that COVID happened, and people were starting to talk about these stimulus checks. And people were like, oh, this is why UBI is needed. This is why you need, no strings attached checks, because, it was funny because Andrew Yang had mentioned, and a lot of people had mentioned in the Yang gang, that so much of what Andrew Yang had talked about was right. The one thing that he was slightly off about was, automation and artificial intelligence is, a problem, but that wasn't the main reason that pushed sort of the advancement of UBI or stimulus checks. It was COVID. COVID was the element that made people realize the importance of a guaranteed income. Because once COVID happened, a lot of people started to credit Andrew Yang for moving that needle towards stimulus checks. Because when you think about it, it's like, had that not been a conversation, what would have happened with Trump and stimulus checks? What would have happened about this whole conversation about free money? Because this was at a time when we definitely needed it. People definitely needed those stimulus checks. We received them. We definitely needed them. And so a lot of non-believers of UBI started to see how much they needed this check. And many folks sort of learned that everything that Yang was talking about when it comes to UBI, at least, was pretty fucking spot on in terms of like giving people the opportunity to say no to toxic work, giving people an opportunity to pay for the basic needs, recognizing the work of people who don't have traditional jobs. So he had a lot of relevance during COVID. And then around that time, that is when he launched Yang Speaks. Now, Yang Speaks was his podcast, and the podcast was really interesting because I thought it was a good transition. He started to bring on a lot of different people from all different walks of life, different politicians, like I think it was like one of the campaign managers of Bernie Sanders, which is Breonna Joy. He brought on mayors for basic income like Michael Tubbs. And he brought out a lot of people who were some celebrities and some politicians, and it was a really interesting opportunity to hear other people talk about new ideas and new concepts, and I liked it. I think that the podcast in general tends to have pretty good candidates, or pretty good guests, and it helped him in terms of continuing this push towards humanity first, continuing this push towards universal basic income, continuing this push towards giving people a no strings attached check. And through this podcast, through some of the work that he was doing in outside organizations, he was like endorsing and funding other candidates in other elections or in other states and in other cities around the United States, and he was supporting the ones who were supporting universal basic income. So I was like, oh my God, okay, this is awesome. Like, this dude, brought this idea to light. He wasn't able to make it to the presidency, but he is sort of, passing the torch and allowing other people to sort of talk about basic income. Like, that's what I wanted for him. I wanted him to be able to push for that. I wanted him to be able to do just that. But then, of course, he had a little announcement. He had his announcement that he was running for mayor. A lot of us expected and wanted him to work his way up and get more experience in politics. A lot of people were like, oh, okay, well, Andrew Yang, he's not qualified to be the president. He needs to start smaller, be a senator, be a mayor, be a governor, whatever. Like, start off small. Before you run the country, try to run a town. So I get it. I get why people wanted him to do that, and in some ways I get why he did it. But there were a lot of people who didn't want him to be in traditional politics at all anymore. Some people didn't want him to join politics because they just didn't like him, and some people didn't want him to join politics because we felt like, there are a lot of bureaucracies and loopholes that he'd have to jump through, and maybe he could do better work from the outside. And for me personally, I was sort of in that camp. I felt like I wanted him to push harder on UBI. I wanted him to blow it up even more and just continue to be this person who's like, you know what, fuck it, I didn't win. I'm still going balls to the fucking wall on UBI, like UBI all day. Like, I wanted him to focus on that. But obviously, I'm not his campaign manager. I'm not Yang. And unfortunately, I don't understand New York politics. I understand talking about politics. I can talk about it from a national perspective. I can talk about it from a social perspective. But when it comes to like local politics, there's shit that it's just hard to understand. And even though we have a majority of the viewers on LAG who live in New York. Me personally, I've never lived in New York. I've never been to New York. So the whole time I was just like, what is he getting into? What is going on? And I was concerned. And I guess it was rightfully so. So before I go into this, let me go ahead and read a couple comments. Inside talk. He never got offered anything from Biden. There was some discussion about some lower level, low impact positions, so his team advised him to run for mayor. The narrative that he turned down an offer from Biden to run is mistaken and false. Yeah, that's weird. I didn't know that some people were spreading this rumor of him getting an offer. I never thought that he got an offer, but I think he was sort of talking about this idea of, and that's what I think was the tricky thing about the verbiage, which is I think other people and he were saying that Biden recognized Andrew Yang as like a smart person or whatever, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're being offered a position. You know what I mean? Like someone could say, hey, I like your outfit, I like your muscles. Doesn't necessarily mean that they want to date you. I see it as one of those things. Like he was getting complimented on something, and then I think maybe Yang and some other people were, extracting way more value than what was really inside there. Link says, I think the concept of free money is not entirely accurate. The money comes from taxes, and Americans pay relatively high taxes, but don't get much in return. Yeah, and that's why I hate the discussion of free money, because it's not free money. It's free money in the same way that, the military gets free money. It's free money in the same way that, we pay for roads and streets with free money. It's the same way that it's free money, the same kind of free money that we use to bail out big banks and corporations. So, if you want to talk about free money, then yeah, let's go ahead and talk about free money. But it's not, like Link says, it comes from somewhere. There's a way that we can actually generate this revenue, and we can use that to actually build our people up. And Hannah said, Chris says, the automation tax should have always been a thing with or without UBI, but especially in conjunction. I totally agree. I totally agree that a VAT tax on automation needs to be put into place. Does anybody else have an issue with a company like Amazon being able to lay off hundreds of people from their warehouse, replacing them with robots, and then not having to pay any taxes on that, not having to, redistribute the enormous wealth of operating a fucking warehouse that is essentially, the connective tissue that has basically replaced, most e-commerce websites. Like, come on now. Like, there is so much opportunity to actually do good through that VAT tax. So, Link says, unemployment money is taxed too, even though we pay it into it through our taxes. I scraped into the next income bracket because I found a new job after being laid off, but ended up paying so much more tax. I had less net income in my previous lower paying job. And Hannah says, he should have invested more in building up his org, Humanity Forward, even though they have zero grassroots apparatus. It's a lobbying house. Yes, 100%. Oh my God, I am so glad, Hannah, you had mentioned that, because I fully agree. I fully agree that he should have taken the momentum that he had from that election in 2020, because he was on, even when he conceded, even though a lot of people had pretty sour thoughts about him, there was still a lot of optimism about this guy, and there was a lot of feeling of oh, he's going to do something big next. He's going to do something great next. He has the potential to do something important next. And I thought that the important thing was going to be investing in his own organization to sort of combat the machine of American politics, and using that sort of apparatus of grassroots, organization, this movement towards universal basic income. I thought he was just going to grow it into just this monster of an issue that okay, now UBI is a question that every politician is being asked about everywhere. That would have been my goal. That is what I would have done. I would have pushed UBI so far into the point where it was just normalized as a regular conversation to have when it came to politics, when it came to interviewing a candidate. I wanted UBI to be one of those things where it's like, are you for UBI? No? Okay, fuck you. Like, you're a bad candidate. I wanted it to be at that level because I think, and I still always will believe that it is one of the most important things that we could push for that could happen in terms of, transforming the landscape of, inequities in the United States. So, last question or last comment over here. Angel says, it isn't free money, it's our money, but strictly speaking, the powers that be most likely refer to it as such in order to stigmatize it. 100%. 100%. Shrewd business people, greedy business people will take a handout from the government and get bailed out for, billions and millions of dollars. And that is their free money, but they will call themselves savvy. They'll call themselves a smart business person because, I took advantage of that tax loophole. But if a poor person, a person who is struggling, a person who is living in poverty, if they accept a stimulus check, they're lazy. I don't think so. So yeah, I 100% agree with Angel that it's completely used as a way to stigmatize this type of aid. Hannah says, inside talk, he did shit with his grassroots supports. A group of us tried for over a year to get him to invest in grassroots. There were C4 orgs popping up that nearly all dissolved because his orgs abandoned them. Yeah, it's a shame. And once we get into this bit over here about his NYC mayoral race, we will get into some of the weeds of why it became even worse. So up until now, I think a lot of people have been sort of like maybe wondering why I've been talking about all these great things. And that's because the ideas were great. Universal basic income is a great idea. Taxing automation and artificial intelligence is a great idea. Focusing on artificial intelligence and automation as the cause of job displacement instead of focusing on immigrants and drumming up fears about immigrants, that is a very good idea. And so there were a lot of things that I really agreed about, but his run for mayor of New York, I don't know what the fuck was going on. So when it first happened, we saw the first ad, the first commercial, and it was sort of on YouTube titled as Why I'm Running. And I gotta say, like, from a feeling perspective, like as an ad, as someone who, works in branding and someone who, like, I would love to have a career where I work on, like, advertising campaigns for social issues. It's like we spend so much money advertising Coca-Cola, advertising BMW, advertising the latest, greatest technology, but we don't invest that same energy into promoting ideas that can reshape our society. And that is one of the goals, again, tangent, but that's one of the goals that I have for, like, my agency. And that's why I was sort of, like, interested when he first dropped this ad, because I was like, oh, I kind of like the feeling of this, right? So it's like, it starts off it's almost like a home movie. People were talking about it, like it almost feels like a home movie. You see his, throughout his campaign, he's wearing a mask, and you're just like, oh my God, great. Like, this is during COVID. He's expressing, very stand-up leadership model behavior by wearing a mask. You can see during the ad campaign, instead of shaking hands, he's, dapping elbows, and it's like, oh, okay, cool. He's like, maintaining social distance. Great. Like, there's this feeling of optimism, this feeling of, okay, maybe we jumped the gun. Maybe he's going to do all right as a mayor. Maybe we're a little bit hopeful. And then he says, like, this line, I came of age, I fell in love, and I became a father here in New York. And you're just like, oh, damn, that feels good. Oh, all right, I get that. I get this fight to be seen as a New Yorker, because I think parallel to the fight for a lot of folks in the AAPI community who are immigrants or who come from immigrant families, and they have this fight to be seen as American, And so like, even though I felt like, man, some of these scenes felt like he's trying to be like, hey, I'm Andrew Yang. I'm from New York. I'm from New York. I'm from New York. Like, it just felt like pandering, right? And you're just like, but at the same time, as an Asian person, like, I get it. I get feeling like an outsider and then feeling like you had to compensate by overly being American, And then I just like drummed up, those thoughts of him telling Asian Americans that they need to be more patriotic. And I was just like, oh my God. But again, I understood it. I was willing to go through it. And so I kind of resonated with that image of him trying hard to be accepted, right? I felt bad, but I understood it. And some of the ideas that he was talking about in his campaign were like, we need to have smaller classrooms. We need to improve the subways. We need to create a people's bank, that allows for financial opportunities for people. We need to have safe reopenings. He even joked around and said, we need to save the Knicks. And it felt like an Andrew Yang campaign, right? It felt like things that were like achievable, smaller classrooms, improving the subways, creating a people's bank, safely reopening the city. I liked it, right? And I felt sad because I know that Asian people shouldn't have to fight to be accepted as Americans, but I just felt like the whole entire energy of the ad was directed at trying to convince people that Andrew Yang belonged here, that Andrew Yang really was a New Yorker, that Andrew Yang, deserved to be in that race. And I think that was almost, in a sense, the last glimmering hope of his campaign, because after that it started to really slide downhill. And oh my God. Hold on, let me get into the next point. Let me just read some comments real quick. Ling says, but the extra 300 per week seems to have led to difficulties in finding service staff. Lee says, don't forget the data dividend project and his fight to have us paid for the data we create online. Another good idea from him, but it's questionable how far it'll go. Yeah, that was another really good thing. Like this idea of, Facebook and Google and a lot of these companies profit off of the data that we provide them. Facebook will track like how many minutes you're on this one page and the interest that you have and your demographics, and that these package this information, they sell it to advertising companies so they can then develop more curtailed brands based off of that information. So they can just be like, okay, I'm going to pay Facebook $3,000 to get all their information on Asian Americans who are interested in new cars. And I'll figure out all this information about what Asian people want in a car, and then I'll go create that car specifically for these people. And so, unfortunately, when that happens, like, we don't get a cut from that. We don't get paid by Google for giving them the information that they use to profit from these, these companies. And so one of Yang's ideas, and one of just the ideas that is available, is this idea of allowing people to profit from their own data and being able to privatize it so you can actually turn on and off whether or not people can have access to that data or not. Hannah says, dude, do it. I am doing it. I am. Yeah, like in terms of, me, wanting to build my agency and wanting to advocate for social and political issues, that is the goal of my agency. So once again, if anybody is, interested in building that platform, reach out to me. All right. Lang says, yes, minimum wage is not living wage and tipping. That's a uniquely American concept. Why should we subsidize wages? Why do tipped workers get like $3 per hour? Yeah, I agree in the sense that, like, tip minimum wage is absolute bullshit. We need to establish a legitimate minimum wage. $15 is the minimum that we should have, because the reality is, with inflation, the actual minimum wage should be like $25. Link says, the concept of the post office bank where you don't have to pay for basic banking services or maintaining a minimum balance is, well, a basic right. I was shocked to learn that we have to pay to get checks cashed. And the concept of building credit is so detrimental to lower income people. Yeah, and again, that was another reason why I really love that idea of building up a people's bank, because like Ling said, you have to have a bank account in order to be able to have access to some of these basic services. And, setting up a People's Bank would also allow for universal basic income, or at least, opening up the door for a universal basic income, which again was kind of weird because in that first ad of Yang, there was no mention of universal basic income. So I'm just like, I thought that's what you wanted to run. Like, didn't you want to run because you wanted to like push universal basic income? Like, didn't you run because you were talking about how like, oh, it's not about me, it's about the ideas? And then that's when, again, we'll go into this next part. Hashtag BodegaGate, aka pandering overblown. So, BodegaGate. So, BodegaGate was basically Andrew Yang and his campaign started off the campaign, the media campaign, right after the ad with this video of him at a bodega, and he was telling people on camera, hey, everybody, like, bodegas are great. They're the lifeblood of New York. I'm getting some stuff from the bodega right now. And he was like, he grabbed some green tea and he awkwardly grabbed some bananas. He was like, yay. And when this went viral, I didn't understand why it went viral. And it's mainly because I was reminded of the fact that culture is very specific. And I don't fully understand New York culture, Not to say that I disagree with it. I just, I have no idea. I was ignorant about it. And, I don't know the ins and outs of New York's culture of, policing and housing and job hunting or dating. And, let alone do I know the culture of bodegas, because, bodegas for a lot of New Yorkers aren't just stores. It's not just a regular store. For a lot of New Yorkers, like a great bodega in your neighborhood is like a safe haven for a lot of locals. It's a place where you can get food and your basic needs, and you can do basic services. And so there are a lot of New Yorkers who, absolutely love their bodegas, and they're an integral part of their communities. But what I didn't understand was that not all small shops are bodegas. That's what I made the mistake on. I thought that a bodega was just like a small New York shop, And apparently the one that Andrew Yang visited, even though it's technically, I guess, like on like Google, like if you look it up on Google, I guess it's technically a bodega. But a lot more people said that this is actually a deli, and that the one that Andrew Yang visited didn't look like the bodegas in their neighborhood. And so the bodega that he went to looked more upscale. And so people were just like, hey, you're running this campaign, but you're not even in a bodega that looks like mine. Like, you're in one that's in one of these nicer neighborhoods, and that sort of became a signal of, okay, well, who are you even running for? And even though it was this minor thing of a bodega, I think, Yang choosing this as his first place to stop, it did signal to some people, and it was sort of a red flag. However, I think he kind of redeemed himself, because you sort of, you learned that, okay, this is like a series of his. Like, he wasn't just going to one bodega, he was going to multiple bodegas, and he was like going to multiple bodegas, and he was like, oh, this bodega is here, and so it kind of like redeemed himself. It was kind of like all right, like, you fucked up that first one, you should have, you shouldn't have, like Jason said, that bodega in particular looked like a Rite Aid, and a lot of people, they noticed it. And so I think it was a horrible way to start. He did kind of redeem himself by going to other bodegas that looked like, other people's bodegas. But I think a lot of people still felt, and I still felt myself, that he was pandering, that he was trying to fight so hard to be a local. He was trying to do this whole, I go to bodegas just like you, bananas, green tea, you've seen this, I get this too, I'm like you. Like, it felt like that, and I didn't like the way that he marketed himself, and I didn't like the way that his campaign started to brand Andrew Yang as this, like, fucking celebrity. Like, even though he does have celebrity status, to treat him like that way just felt kind of weird. Like, it just felt awkward. Like, you can't, you know, you can't make a video of you touring your city as if you're a tourist. You know what I mean? And that's what it felt like. It felt like white kids from the Midwest going to New York and making TikToks. Hey guys, I'm in the bodega right now, and look, these bananas. Isn't it so weird? Oh, look at this New York banana. Like, it felt really bizarre. Like, what are you doing, bro? Like, what are you doing? You know? And like, I thought, if I were handling his campaign, I think he should have just started off by, like, I think the approach of talking about bodegas, especially in the era of COVID, where a lot of people couldn't go out to different stores, you couldn't go very far, and so bodegas really were the lifeblood of a lot of people who, like, couldn't travel around, and they had to be able to get, their basic needs fulfilled at their local bodegas. So I get the idea to target bodegas as a subject, but the way that he went about it was all wrong. He should have featured stories and the lives and the opinions of the people from the bodegas. He should have, like, actually gone to the bodegas and, like, talked to these people, and, like, the first videos were him featuring these people and talking about, like, hey, what's it been like dealing with COVID, and what's it been like, are you holding up? Hey everybody, this is a bodega here in New York, blah 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 street. I don't know, you New Yorkers and your fast talking, like, oh, it's on 24th and blah blah. Like, I always love that shit because it just sounds like the movies, like, like knowing every damn cross street and being able to explain it that way, because I can't do that shit at all. But, like, that would have been cool, that would have been a better way to at least introduce the idea of bodegas. Edward says, did he ever go, hey guys, I'm having a chopped cheeseburger? Like, he should have just, like, that would have been cool. Like, Andrew Yang, walking into a bodega with or like, the video starts with Andrew Yang and a bodega cat on his lap, and he's eating a chopped cheese and he's having a conversation with the owner. Like, that would have been the video. That would have been the video. Instead of, fucking, hey guys, the Andrew Yang YouTube channel here. Like, bro, you were not a YouTube traveler. What are you doing? You're running for New York. You can't be like, I'm not from New York. I don't know shit about New York. But the one thing that I do know about New York is that New Yorkers don't like tourists, because most people who live in these heavily dense areas, having went to school in San Francisco and having, grown up in the Bay Area, I know that San Francisco's don't like hanging out in Union Square with all of the tourists. So it's, no surprise that it's the same thing with New Yorkers. So yeah, I just felt like this was, like, pandering, overblown, and he should have featured the stories of these people. He shouldn't. This whole where will Andrew Yang go next shit, I hated it. I think it was a really bad approach to his campaign. And then we get into some of the other issues, because, I mean, Bodega Gate was, like, the first of many. You really can create a Andrew Yang pandering cringe compilation of just a compilation of the many campaign fails that, like, it's so ironic because, here's a candidate who rose through obscurity on social media, used social media to really understand the landscape of, like, underground media, going to talk on different podcasts. And then his actual media campaign is, like, just a fucking series of social media fails. So more than just Bodega Gate, he said other things like, I guess he was on an interview and he was talking about how, like, COVID is really difficult. And then he said something like, can you imagine doing virtual schools in your 2-bedroom apartment? And he was, like, tweeting that while he was living in his second home. And a lot of New Yorkers who were, like, experiencing what it was like being the epicenter of the pandemic started to look at this dude like, what the fuck are you talking about, bro? Like, some of us live in not even a 1-bedroom apartment. We live in tiny studios. What do you mean it's difficult to do Zoom school in a 2-bedroom apartment? What about the families who are doing Zoom school with kids in a 0-bedroom apartment, in a studio, people who are sharing homes with other people? Like, do you even understand the scope of this? Do you understand like how bad people have it? And it just came off as, and this was another case of like, Andrew Yang, this isn't the right time to be, awkwardly laughing. Like, people don't think that this is a funny thing, like, yeah, I get it. Like, if you're a parent, and as Andrew Yang, like, yeah, I get it from the perspective of COVID happens. What is this thing? I have 2 young children, and I need to make them safe. I understand. Like, I'm not blaming him for actually going to his second home and living there while COVID is going on. I'm blaming him for using that as a talking point to be like, oh, thank God I avoided that catastrophe by staying in my, my mansion. It's like, bro, you're trying to get elected by the people, and you're pulling this shit like, way to position yourself up here in this ivory tower and making yourself seem very inaccessible. Hannah says, I was back channeling with his team to hand him a motherfucking chopped cheese at his next appearance. Angel says, I remember that. The optics for his campaigning was just, yeah, it was major cringe. Jason says, when he said he consensually chokes bitches, it was too much cringe for me to handle, even though it was rather sex positive of him. What? I had no idea he said that shit. I I mean, I don't even know what to say about that. I have to see what it is like. Yeah, I'll have to look at that up. But sorry, I'm just like taken aback. But yeah, so after that whole virtual school in your 2-bedroom apartment kind of thing. Then was the whole photo op where he posted this photo of him on the public transit, and he was like going to the Bronx, and apparently people were like looking at where he actually was and where that the subway train, like, again, I'm not a New Yorker. Subway is a train. What do you refer to? He was on public transit, and he was like, people were like, you're not even going to the Bronx. Like, you're on the wrong train or whatever. And people were just sort of talking about how, this is just another case of Andrew Yang doesn't know the city. And so, especially when you are branding your whole campaign as, I'm Andrew Yang and I'm from New York, and then you're doing this, it's like, it just completely deflates your entire message. And this is why I think his campaign should have never been focused on, I'm New York. Instead, it should have been like, I understand the problems, and I might not have been here for as long as a lot of other people, but like, I'm willing to do whatever it takes to, understand and get to the root of these issues and then solve them. But nope. Instead, he started to do this shit. And again, this is also on the blame of his campaign managers, like the people who are directing him and telling him, all right, we need to go this area. Because I know he's not posting this on social media. He himself isn't just posting this shit. He has a team of people who are taking photos of him. Someone took this photo. Someone posted this photo. Someone put a capture on this photo. And so, I'm hoping that was the case, but it just seemed like there were just so many of these cases. And then there was the other issue of Andrew Yang coming out and talking about like being against street vendors and saying, oh, I've talked to a lot of people, and a lot of people in New York have said that one of their biggest concerns is street vendors and their illegal licenses. And people were like, what the fuck? Like, how is that the priority? Like, if anything, a lot of these places were sort of being a safe haven by offering food and providing like fresh food in the wake of a lot of these other restaurants closing down during COVID. And so a lot of folks felt like Andrew Yang was targeting these street vendors who were like the lifeblood of a lot of New Yorkers' neighborhoods, and that he was targeting immigrants, who make up a large group of the people who are street vendors. And so there was just a lot of bad optics of just like wrong things being said. And again, this was just like, this was just him starting off, right? This is just him ramping things up. And then it got even worse. So I think that Andrew Yang had a weak response to stop AAPI hate. And it's unfortunate that he did, but it's not surprising that he did. Especially me talking about how he just doesn't have a sophisticated understanding of race and racism and white supremacy, and he is in a position where, he just doesn't, he's not the type of, like, he's the type of person who, I don't want to ruffle any feathers, I don't want to blatantly call out white supremacy, but he needs to. Like, especially when there are other white candidates who are willing to call out white supremacy by name, you need to do that. Like, you need to, have a fucking backbone and say that is a problem. And even though the spread of COVID really is the genesis of why anti-Asian violence has increased around the world. And anti-Asian racism caused by Donald Trump and his, China virus accusations, it really started to build up a lot of anti-Asian racism, a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment. And so the world was at a place where they were blaming Asians for COVID. A lot of people were blaming Asians for why I can't go to school anymore. My life's changed. It's all because of you guys. Oh, you fuckers need to go back to your country. This, it's because you're eating dogs. Look what you guys are eating all the time. Like, it was terrible, and it's still terrible, and it's still going on. And for a lot of Asian Americans and Asian people in general, they couldn't hide from COVID, and they couldn't hide from being associated with COVID, because even in the weirdness of America being a place where people can now wear masks and wearing masks are normal, even in that case, Asian people had their eyes still exposed, and a lot of Asian people still felt like they couldn't hide. They couldn't hide because even with their mask on, our eyes gave us away. And so there were a lot of elderly Asian people who were attacked in New York and around the country. Asian Americans who were punched, who were pushed, who were slashed in the face, Asian Americans who had acid thrown at them. It's horrible. It's absolutely horrible. And in response to this violence, I think a lot of the people in the AAPI community were looking for answers, and naturally started to look at Andrew Yang for answers. But Andrew's lack of racial knowledge caught up to him in a really big way. He didn't have the understanding or the guts or the advice to tell America and to tell Asians that it was conservative media and that it was Trump. And these are the reasons why a lot of people start to have this, boldness to attack Asians, to blame Asians. And then on top of that, it's the issue of, a lack of support for communities, and the fact that people are just so desperate. People who are don't have outlets for themselves resort to violence. And so, I had watched a rally that this photo is taken from of Andrew Yang. I watched the whole entire speech, and I was like, okay, let's go see what he says about AIPI hate. And he kicked off his rally saying, this violence, this thing that's happening to us, it's morphing into something murderous and dark and dangerous. And I get what he's saying about the violence and stuff like that, but then when he starts talking about dark and dangerous, all I think of are all the conservatives and the centrists who are thinking to themselves, oh, he's talking about all these black people. Because unfortunately, and I've mentioned this before, one of the things that I think is so disgusting about the way Asian Americans have talked about Stop AAPI Hate is the way that so many of them have singularly blamed black people for this rise in anti-Asian violence. Even though the, statistics show that most of the people, over 75% of the people who are actually attacking Asian people are white people. And so I was just worried that like once he started to get into this language that people were going to start reading into it as him thinking that like, oh, he thinks it's black people too. Like, and I was just starting to cringe. But during the speech, he did give a nod to some of the black folks who were in the rally, who were like there in support of Asian Americans in solidarity. And he had specifically said that, hey, I am in debt to the black community for their solidarity, for, the support that he received from Martin Luther King Jr.'s family. And so, he recognized that Asian people can be victims of hate crimes. And so he, did a lot of healing in that regard. But as far as his solution to this problem, his solution was that he wanted to establish an anti-Asian task force. And in my mind, the way that reads is more police. And it doesn't work. It doesn't work because this idea that you can stop AAPI hate by increasing police presence ignores the reality that Asian people are also victims of police brutality. Like we had just talked about the story of Angela Quinto, who is, a Filipino American man who was experiencing a mental health episode at his home, and he started going to his family members and like hugging them out of, I don't know what sort of reaction was going on, but he started like hugging them, and his family got confused about what he was doing. So they called the cops, and the cops came in. They busted through Angelo Quinto's family's home, and they kneeled on this dude's neck for like 9 minutes or something, and he died. Like he died in their living room, screaming at them to stop, screaming at them that like, oh, like don't kill me. And then you just see this video of the fucking cops like dragging his body out, and this is just one case of many of cops brutalizing Asian Americans. There's the case of Tommy Lee, the newly graduated high school student who was, on the day of his graduation, he got shot and killed by police because they thought he was holding a knife and he was holding a pen. So this is an issue in the Asian American community, and it's especially an issue in the Asian American community for brown Asians. So this is why it's an issue that like I feel very close to, because I'm like, brown Asians and South Asians and Southeast Asians are oftentimes ignored in these conversations about what goes on with the AAPI community. And so, him, like Andrew Yang, just simply saying we need more cops, it's not the answer. It wasn't the solution. And I think one of the biggest problems with his line of thinking of this was that in talking about, his diagnosis of the problem, because he's talking about, okay, stop AAPI hate, blah, blah, blah. I wanted to know what he thought the issue was, where he thought the problem lied, and according to his speech, and then according to like some of his other speeches where he talks about this issue, his diagnosis for what's going on to the Asian American Pacific Islander community is that we have too many mentally ill people on the streets. And when I heard that shit, I was like, what the fuck? And that's what I want to go into next. Yang's horrible comments on mental illness. So he says this idea that, there's too many mentally ill people on the streets. Now, I have to say that like I said, I don't have this experience in New York because I have never lived there. I've never visited there. So I don't know what it is like for a lot of people who are, who experience this on the day to day. Because apparently, he said that he talked to people, he'd gone on these interviews, and people were saying that, oh, one of the biggest problems is, people, mentally ill people out on the streets, homeless people out on the streets. And my issue was that he started to sort of describe the criminals specifically as mentally ill criminals, which further demonizes and perpetuates ableism, because, blaming violence on someone's mental illness is the wrong fucking move. It should have been blaming the failed systems where mentally ill people don't have the care that they need, blaming the system that doesn't provide outlets where they can actually express themselves in a way that doesn't result in violence. Because violence in and of itself isn't just totally random, like what a lot of conservatives think of, which, they use as a way to drum up fears about, home invasions and why you need to have guns. But violence is a byproduct of prolonged exposure to a very specific environment. And instead of talking about that, instead of talking about the root of these problems, he just blamed mentally ill people, And so, plenty of mentally ill people have their needs met where violence isn't actually an option, where violence isn't an option that they have to resort to. And so, I get it from the perspective of talking about how if there are mentally ill people who are unhoused, that they deserve to have a safe place to stay and to get help. I agree with the message on that front, but I don't agree with the way that he phrased it. I don't agree with the way that he made it seem as if there is this direct link to, it's not just criminals, but it's mentally ill criminals. Because it's like, okay, again, I don't know enough about New York politics, but I do know, and I do enough to say that, like, there's more than just that type of crime. There's also blue collar crime. There's also, white collar crime. There's also people doing crime all up and down fucking Wall Street. So it's like, there's so many different ways you can attack the problems of New York, but for him to focus it on mentally ill people was just fucked up. And I think what it did was it made a lot of New Yorkers who are struggling with money and who are struggling with mental health issues, it made them think like, okay, well, what happens if I get out on the street? Like, is Yang going to treat me this way? And in one of his speeches, where he's talking about, the AAPI hate situation, he starts talking about like, oh, okay, yeah, homelessness. It's, sure, there's a human cost to it, but it costs $6,000 a month. And I was just like, hold on a second. Why did you just brush off the human cost of having unhoused people as if that was just sort of like a side dish, and that the main issue was that it just cost a lot of money? That the main issue was that it cost $6,000. And that really pissed me off, because I was like, all right, who the fuck is this guy? Who is this man who, I felt totally different about. A lot of us felt totally different about. Where is the person who was all about humanity first? Where you're talking about, it shouldn't matter about the cost to actually help people. It should matter that we actually help people at all. All right. I am getting some sort of weird message on my streaming thing. It keeps cutting out, but let me know if it's cutting out or not, or if I'm tripping. Anywho, I seem like I might be dropping some frames, but yeah, so I was frustrated that he didn't go and talk about mental illness from the perspective of preventative care, talking about how do we stop the problem from the root? How do we create better solutions that don't involve just more cops? And that goes into another issue of mine, which is that he was, all of his solutions seemed to be just very, very pro-cop. Now, I will say that, like, when it came to these interviews during the debates and different appearances, a lot of people were asking him and telling Andrew Yang, hey, many New Yorkers believe that crime is a top priority. What are you going to do to stop crime? What are you going to do to address gun violence? And I know that this is, again, something that is very contentious in New York, and a lot of people want answers for this. And Yang, again, his solution was that he wants to resource and support police to solve these crimes. He wants, to pump in money and resources to expand police presence. And he specifically says that he didn't want to defund the police. He says that he disagrees with the idea of defunding the police. And now I will say that, like, on a personal admission, on the subject of violent crime or gun violence, I'm not going to claim to know how to solve this issue. I think on the long-term end, you support this by, supporting people, aggressively investing in disadvantaged communities, providing them with all the resources they need so they don't have to resort to some of these things. But in terms of the short term, I don't know what to do. Like, I don't know what to do. And, but I do know that a lot of people were against the fact that Yang stood firmly against defunding the police and just writing off the whole entire validity of this movement. And some of the things that he said was like he supports having more cops who are from New York. And I know that this can kind of be sort of a tricky thing because Yang was going against Eric Adams, and Eric Adams, to my understanding, is a lifetime cop, someone who has spent basically his entire career in law enforcement. So he's a literal cop, and yet he's winning. So I will say that is kind of confusing as somebody who was looking at it from the outside because I don't know enough about Eric Adams. But I do think it was weird that some people were saying it's bad that Yang is pro-cop, so then let's vote for the cop. I don't know. Like I said, someone can school me on this, but I just felt like, okay, if you don't need more cops, then why have, the cop king? I don't know. Neela says, true, his comments also feed into the stereotype that mentally ill people are violent, when in reality, they're more likely to be victims of violence. 100%. 100%. And that's the nuance that he didn't have. And that's the nuance that I think that he showed some of that nuance during his 2020 campaign, but he did not show that during his run for mayor. I know we're going over, but we still have a couple things to talk about. All right, Yang's shitty one-sided take on Israel versus Palestine. So Yang tweeted in support of Israel. He was criticized as making this move because he wanted to win over New York's Jewish community. And a lot of people were saying that he wanted to make this move because he was losing voters, because he was bleeding so many voters that he just felt like, oh shit, I need to do something. Let me go ahead and tweet about Israel, which was not the business. Because instead of employing the necessary nuance needed to talk about something as vast as the issue of Israel versus Palestine, instead Andrew Yang took a 100% side with Israel and called them like victims of this whole entire thing. And so, the Israeli and Palestinian conflict doesn't just begin with, oh, the Palestinians, they're shooting bombs, which, if you want to get into the weeds of it, when Palestine shoots bombs, Israel has the benefit of a super military defense dome that can shoot missiles out of the sky, and Palestine doesn't. So when Israel sends their bombs, they land. So it's a very, if we want to talk about the details of that, it is very different. And I mean, the genesis of this conflict of what's going on with them, and I know there's a whole lot more history, but really the conflict, in terms of how we discuss it, starts with Israel forcibly removing and evicting Palestinians from their homes, restricting their civil rights, and murdering families and children. And again, Andrew Yang doesn't employ any of this nuance, any of this detail, and he just drew a line in the sand and said, I stand with Israel. And by doing that, he also unapologetically dismisses Palestinians, and he dismisses a lot of, progressives and people of color who come from colonized countries, who experience and who know firsthand what it's like to be, removed from your country. So I was just like, what the fuck is he thinking? What the fuck was he thinking? Why didn't Andrew Yang just shut up or admit that he didn't know anything? Just do that. Just admit you don't know it. Just admit that you are not the person to talk about this. But the result was that by talking about something that he didn't fully know about and really leaning into it, he just lost more voters. He lost even more voters, and he just became labeled as a Zionist. He became, known as somebody who was just very amateur when it came to discussing international politics and colonization. He didn't do his homework. He's had a problem with this before, he didn't really have complete answers when he was asked about Israel during his 2020 campaign. And yet here he is, like, fully leaning into it. He didn't do his research. He didn't study up. He didn't improve. And so, in looking at this, I remember I was watching this video, right, of some New Yorkers confronting Andrew Yang out on the street, holding a phone to him and asking him, like, why do you feel this way about Israel? And, they're asking him, and he's trying to talk about it, and he's trying to sort of give an answer. And then they're sort of asking him, like, do you support the violence that Israel is doing? And then he's just not saying anything. And then all of a sudden, you see this white guy coming in between him and the other people, and he's like, all right, nope, no. Like he's silencing Yang. He doesn't want him to just admit the fact that Israel, murdering Palestinians is a bad thing. Like, he was preventing Andrew Yang from saying that. And I was like, whoa, what the fuck is going on? Who is this dude? Who is this random white guy? And that is when we get to the last section of his mayoral race, which is the discussion of Tusk strategies, his consultants, aka consultant overload. So, like I said before, local politics is a very different ballgame. It's a very different ballgame from national politics. And Yang knew that. I knew that. A lot of people knew that. He wasn't, he probably wasn't going to be equipped. And so he hired these consultants to strategize his campaign for New York. And he hired Tusk Strategies. And Tusk Strategies says, on their website, that they're all about creating complex political campaigns, whatever that is. And Tusk Strategies is founded by Bradley Tusk, who is a 47-year-old wealthy white political strategist. He is a lobbyist. He is a venture capitalist from New York. He has worked for Chuck Schumer. He has worked for Michael Bloomberg. And he has worked for Rod Blagojevich. Brad has a venture capital firm, and he invests in a number of companies. Some of the most notable ones are Bird, the electric scooter company, Coinbase, cryptocurrency, Latch, the company called Latch, which is a keyless entry company that you can open the door from, like, your smartphone or whatever. He worked for Lehman Brothers, which, rewind the clock on that. And he also worked towards expanding charter schools. So there's already a lot of red flags in this man's interest. Just based off of how New Yorkers feel about some of these things. And just based off of how a lot of progressives feel about things like electric scooters or cryptocurrency, or Lehman Brothers, And so Brad has a history of working with and for corporate interests. That is his shtick. And we have to also understand that when these companies thrive, Brad thrives because he owns a stake in them. And one of the things that Brad has said about Andrew Yang and described him as is an empty vessel, which I thought was really weird, because that just proves that he doesn't actually understand Andrew Yang's brand. He doesn't understand the Yang Gang. He doesn't understand this landscape. Who the fuck is this guy? Like, is he the one who's sort of feeding him these ideas to pursue this, pursue that, and, like, say this, make this video, talk about that, not talk about this? Like, because if so, it makes sense. If so, this idea of the empty vessel, I mean, if you want to talk about if we want to sort of expand and talk about, critical race theory for just a second, I mean, there is already the huge issue of white people looking at people of color and their cultures and their people as vessels, as, oh, your culture doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if I appropriate. I mean, it's the same thing, right? Like, I'm respecting it, you're respecting it. What's the difference? So, this idea that Andrew Yang was just a vessel, an empty vessel for this fucking rich white man was very concerning. Very concerning. And when Andrew Yang was asked about why he partnered with Tusk Strategies, he said, I chose Tusk because they are experts in New York politics. So I was like, okay, let's see it. Well, shortly after him teaming up with Tusk Strategies, you see Andrew Yang endorsing casinos in New York because, oh, hey, this might be opportunities for people. But coincidentally, it aligns with the strategies of Bradley Tusk's investment, which is in casinos. Yang also was, whatchamacallit, so the same. Now, I will say that the same accusations about being tied to corporate interests can be said about other candidates, and in particular Eric Adams, who, he has ties to lobbyists in the e-bike industry. And so I'm not trying to say that Yang is the only one, and I'm not trying to say that, oh, well, because Eric Adams does it, it's fine for Yang to do it. I'm saying it's bad for both of them to do it. And so another example is you have Yang advocating to make New York City the Bitcoin capital of the United States, which, again, aligns with Bradley Tusk and his investment in Coinbase. And then you have even more alarming is the fact that one of the companies that Tusk owns or has an investment in, which is Latch, the keyless entry company. It's a company that's been criticized because the technology could potentially be used to allow landlords to surveil and watch over their tenants. And so there's a lot of issues with I don't know. Hannah says the consultants were the cherry on top of Yang's existing white bro inner circle. Yeah. And that's what was really troubling, because even though I had a certain feeling about Andrew Yang's campaign manager being that white dude, Zach Groman, and I was like, what does this dude know about representing our community? It just like Hannah said, it just became worse, because when you looked at the website and the people who worked at Tusk, white people as far as the eye can see. Even though there were some people of color, for the most part, all the people who were basically working under Yang were a bunch of fucking out of touch white people. Luisa says Yang's hiring of consultants show how out of touch he is. Yep. 100%. And it's one of those things where it's like, if you were really a New Yorker, if you really were the whole I'm Andrew Yang, I'm from New York, why did you need these consultants, and why did you need those ones? And so, yeah, a whole 3+ members of the Latch company, and these are people who were high-ranking executives. All of a sudden, now they are the ones who are managing Yang's campaign, and you're just hold on a second, what is with this fucking consultant company? What is with all of them putting their fucking grubby hands on this movement and warping it into this fucking pro-comp, pro-Israel bullshit? I don't understand what is going on with this man's brand. I don't understand what is going on with this fool's set of values. Did he just flip-flop and just change out of nowhere? Because a lot of these things seem very antithetical to some of the values that he was talking about. And turns out Andrew Yang's paying these people $33,000 a month. A whole fucking person's salary every month. Whew. Wild. And so, yeah, I think that this consultant company really fucked him over and ruined his brand. I think all the white folks who are a part of this campaign blocked out any of the voices of people of color, and they ultimately lost those voters. They are the ones who fucking lost those voters for him. And I'm not trying to say that it's only their fault, because Yang is obviously the candidate and it's his fault too. But you can definitely tell that they were a major player in why he fucking failed. All right. Now that we've gone through just the beating of Yang, and just hopefully if he's fucking watching this shit, it's the shaking of him and waking him up. This is the part where we talk about the future. This is the part where we talk about what happens next. So, what should Yang do next? Is he fully canceled? It depends. I think that for some people, his brand is fully ruined. Once you take that side on Israel, once you take that side supporting the police, your brand is dead. And some people are just never going to want to, fuck with Andrew Yang ever again. Will he be running for mayor again? Will he be running for president again? I don't think so, because if he lost those 2 times, he might try something else, or he might, throw his hat in the ring again. But especially with the way that he fucked up New York, he like if he tried to run in New York again, people would just be drumming up Bodega Gate in all of his comments again and again and again and again and again. And especially since it happened during COVID, it's like people don't forget. People are not going to forget. And so I'd say that the next option for him is to really just go back to what he was doing and push for UBI. Push the hell out of humanity forward. Push the hell out of universal basic income. Work from the outside, and try to get work done like that. If you can't get actually elected into office, then, support all the people who are trying to get that way. How does Yang redeem himself? Does he? Can he? Like I said, for a lot of issues, you can't go back, but what he can do is he can admit that he fucked up. He can admit that he fucked up on taking such a one-sided approach to Israel. He can apologize for completely just, diminishing, defund the police without actually addressing why people care about this and why it's important and why more police aren't the answer. He can admit his fuck-ups by talking about why he goofed so fucking hard talking about mental illness and the fact that these people aren't the problem. They are a byproduct of a failed system. And that is the problem. He can redeem himself by going back to his roots as just being the fucking neutral good guy. Like, I would, at this point, I'm like, fuck it. Let's get him back on Ben Shapiro's show arguing with them, because I would much rather have that than him, straight up just like, appealing to these people. I think that he can also redeem himself by just fully embracing the inherent nature and the inherent progressiveness of change. Like, that's the reality. The reality is, as we progress forward, as we try to evolve as a society, and as we try to make things more equitable for everybody else, we have to be able to employ progressive policies. Conservative policies are only going to sort of, conserve us in a outdated mindset. So I think as Andrew Yang tries to redeem himself, he has to understand that it's not a bad thing to be a progressive. It's not a bad thing to be like, aggressively progressive. And I think his key and his strategy is that as a business person, he should be the individual who pushes for things like universal basic income. And he should be able to be the type of person who can take some of these fringe ideas from the left and learn how to market them. Because that for me was why I voted for him. I voted for him and I wanted him to win because I felt like he had the skill set and he had the brand personality where he could take things like Medicare for all and he could take things like universal basic income and he could sell it to a group of people who traditionally were lifelong conservatives. And that was one of the reasons why I thought he was so strong, that he was so convincing. He needs to go back to that. He needs to go back on the fact that this is who I am. I'm the person who is the good guy. I am not the fucking pro-cop, pro-Israel person. Like, that is not me. He needs to be able to brush up on race and learn how to be able to talk about Asian American identities and learn how to talk about international politics. He needs to be able to brush up and learn and understand and unpack his internalized ableism and how he talks about people with mental illness. He needs to be able to talk about capitalism and the fact that not all solutions need to be rooted in starting a business. And, he needs to, I don't think he needs to run for office. I think that in order for him to do all this work, he needs to, do more grassroots stuff. He needs to build a core of political ideas and values of his that aren't going to shake, and I thought that it wasn't going to shake. And unfortunately, the New York race, proved that he unfortunately is corruptible, and he can be influenced by some of these rich fucking people. And I think that's really why, Bernie Sanders and his brand, his political brand, has thrived, because he's really consistent with his values and he hasn't changed as much. Now, as far as the lessons that we can learn, what we can learn from Andrew Yang's rise and his ultimate failures is, one, don't idolize people. Luckily, I I supported the hell out of him. But I never saw him as immune. I never saw him as a person that couldn't be criticized. I never saw him as a person who, was free from judgment because, oh, well, he's Asian and he's running for, no, if he says something fucked up, it's on the table. We need to talk about it. So it's okay to even radically support somebody, but just don't make them immune from your own criticism. People change, and unfortunately, people change for the better or for the worse. And sometimes people also change for the better and the worse, and then they get worse, and then they get better again. So people aren't, this linear timeline where you just continually get worse or you continually get better. So I am hopeful that he can change. I think that Andrew Yang, he may venture deeper into politics, and unfortunately, he might actually get worse. He might start to support corporations and cops even more. That also is a reality. I can't just sit here and say that, oh my God, Andrew Yang, he fucked up, but oh wow, he's really a good guy though. At this point, I don't know. I don't know what he's up to. I don't know if he is going to be solid on his stance on the police. I don't know if he's going to continually defund the police or dismiss what's going on with Israel or mental illness. I don't know. He hasn't apologized for that. He hasn't rectified that, and he needs to. And I also want to say that in terms of things that we learned, we have definitely learned that, we as supporters and as an audience and as voters, we have a huge capability to actually shift how politicians are, how their campaigns are. Because at the end of the day, Yang Gang is a amalgamation of a bunch of individual people. And each individual person has a capacity to change that candidate or to change the landscape of their campaign or to change the conversations about that people or about that candidate. And so it's just a lesson to you that, and to us, to be involved in politics and to be in when you are voting for somebody. If you were voting for somebody and you're throwing your weight behind them, you can ask for some things to change. If you think a politician is weak on an issue or they need to amplify another issue that they're really strong on, tell them, communicate with them, let them know, try to steer them in a better direction. Because, when we don't actually do that, when we don't go through the process of trying to push these people in a better direction, there are other people who are going to push them in the opposite direction. And then my final thing that I want to say is don't throw out the UBI baby out with the Yang bathwater. So out of all this, if you want to walk away with anything, it's just that universal basic income deserves to exist and to thrive despite Andrew Yang. Andrew Yang could be a nothing tomorrow, today. And as long as the fight for UBI continues, that's totally fine. Because in my eyes, universal basic income was always, and always will be, bigger than Andrew Yang, bigger than any one name, because it is a solution for everybody. And we need to stop linking universal basic income directly with Andrew Yang because he didn't create it. And by doing so, we create this dynamic where people think, well, I don't like Andrew Yang, therefore I don't like universal basic income. It's well, no, that doesn't have to be the option. And so if Yang can't bring his focus back to universal basic income, I just don't think that he'll ever win. I don't think that he'll ever win, and I don't think that he'll ever have a meaningful position in the public forum unless he can get back to why people loved him in the first place. And if he wants to be a numbers guy, if he wants to be the candidate who is willing to do the math to understand why our society is fucked up and how we can change things and how we can fix things, he needs to do his homework. He needs to do his homework, and he needs to understand that UBI is the highlight of this, and UBI is what got him there, and UBI is what will bring him back if he has that interest. Whew. All right, folks, that is it. I covered a lot of ground. This is a 2.5 hour discussion. So I had no idea that we were going to go so over, but I had a lot of things that I wanted to say. I know a lot of you had talked about a lot of different things that I had to include and discuss, because I didn't want to leave it out. I didn't want to leave out all the things that were going on in New York. But I know that I still have left out certain things. So I don't want to keep you all too late. It's been, again, 2.5 hours. And I want to thank all of you who have been here for like the duration of this live stream. Honestly, thank you so much. I love you all so much. And I'm going to go ahead and say goodbye to everybody. If you haven't commented recently and you want me to say goodbye to you, drop a line, because I can only say bye to people who I can see who commented, because Facebook doesn't give me a list of the people who are in the chat. But again, thank you all for joining me in this discussion. I think it was a really great conversation about Andrew Yang, his campaign, how he failed, what he did right, and some of the things that we can learn. And you all really contributed to this conversation. So thank you so much for your input and for your contributions. So let me go ahead and thank Rhonda, who said, glad I caught your analysis. Thank you. Hannah, you said, you want to know the future of basic income? I got you. It's way more than Yang. Basic income March in September. Income movement, mayors for a guaranteed income, and a BIG Congress. Ooh. See, I might have to go ahead and dip my toes in that, because, again, that is a thing that I am all for. I am all for that, and I want that to actually be a greater focus within my sort of political ambitions, which is to help boost universal basic income. All right, let me go ahead and thank Rhonda. I want to go ahead and thank Hannah for joining us, Louisa. I want to go ahead and thank Angel, Neela. I want to thank Edward, Jason McCoy. I want to thank Lee. Who else do we have in here? I want to thank Ling, William, Chris, Liz, Anns, and I think that is all that I have here. And Melissa and Rochelle, who said, great conversation. Thank you for being so thorough. Melissa says, really informative analysis. Happy I caught it. I'm happy you all joined us today. And again, I will have this available over on Facebook, so you can go ahead and check that out. And I know I've been saying this for a really long time, and I know you've been waiting for this. I'm finally going to be able to start putting office hours onto the YouTube channel. So if you want to go ahead and watch it there, have it in the background, you can go ahead and do that. Again, if you want to go ahead and reach out to me, contact me, you want to work on building out your social media platform. If you have a political platform that you're trying to grow, you want to start a campaign, look, I'm here. I want to go ahead and do some of that work. And we'll go ahead and keep in touch. And I will see you all next week on office hours. Hopefully it's not going to be as intense. We'll be a little bit more relaxed. So thank you all. Take care. Have a wonderful Monday. I love you. Bye-bye, everybody. Take care.